Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and welcome to part 2 of Wild Force, an almost great season. We ended last time by talking about several main characters, so we'll continue our analysis by taking a look at Cole Evans. Before we talk about him though, I'll discuss Rick Medina, as I said I would, and hopefully I never have to discuss this matter a second time. Rick Medina stabbed his roommate to death. As such, he was eventually sentenced to prison after a bunch of legal procedures that I will not get into. This is something I thought would get brought up a lot when I made my samurai video way back when, since Rick portrayed a sword-wielding villain in that season. Thankfully, most of you guys were classier than that. Neither I nor any of us were actually there, so who's to say what with regards to self-defense and the confrontation and how it really went down. Here's what I know. Whether fair or not, the optics of this event will forever be the Ranger actor that took his role a little bit too far. And honestly, it's hard to describe just how terrible that feels. Maybe I'm asking for too much, not in this case, but just in general. Maybe I'm the dumb one for expecting my heroes to act the part in real life in their own ways. Aaron Cahill does, David Yost does, Mike Jin might be my favorite person on Twitter right now, heck, even Andrew Gray, whose character I've criticized to hell and back, seems like a genuinely great human being. But maybe it's unfair to hold every Ranger to that standard, because for better and for worse, they're all just people like you and me. People very capable of bad things as well as good. All that having been said, I don't think it's fair to chastise the character for the actions of the man. And I'll admit, I've been unfair at times. We understand how tragic the situation is, but the situation doesn't have anything to do with Cole. These events have placed an unfortunate spin on the season for many. Between that and the coolest Megazord here, coincidentally sharing a name with some not so cool people, only adds to this unfortunate retrospective branding. And just to be absolutely clear about this, I am in no way saying that the retrospective branding is anywhere near as tragic as the event itself. But here's a good example of what I believe. I think Nick Russell is a terrible character. I've made that point exceptionally clear over many videos. But when Frias Denari appeared in Hacksaw Ridge, I thought that was pretty cool. In fact, I was happy to see a former Ranger doing well for himself as part of a very good film. And I say that while also not liking the man who directed the film. My point being that there should be a separation there. If you personally are unable to make that separation, I honestly can't blame you. This is very serious stuff we're talking about. That's just where I'm coming from, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, sappy music off, now back to the fun part. I think Cole Evans is a very, very good Red Ranger. He is as genuine and big-hearted a Ranger as we have ever gotten. While so many so-called leaders nowadays fear emotion, like Saban will run over and spank them if they so much as smile, Cole was the real deal. He had passion and command with every word he uttered, even if he could stand to have a bit more structure. But if nothing else, he proves every step of the way that he cares, and that he'd sacrifice it all to save the world, as was proven in his definitive moment, where he stood up with no powers and barely any clothes and kept on fighting. Once again, driving his teammates forward, even with everything going against them. But his big heart is good for more than just heroic moments. Even after all the pain that Master Org caused him, even after having to face his goons episode after episode, Cole still values his life. One of the first things he does after the Rangers win the day is visit Dr. Adler's grave to wish him peace. In a season about heart and life and fighting spirit, Cole defines all of that exceptionally well, and he does it without a very firm narrative base to stand on. His character was relatively simple in construct, but I think that worked here. It didn't always work though, because while I think Cole is a really good Ranger, his leadership skills are a little lacking. He's not a bad leader at all, but when he's not shouting down enemies, he's not as much of one. And what this ended up creating was a team of Rangers that don't have a ton of connecting points. That's not really on Cole as much as it is on the writers, but this team just wasn't as cohesive as they could have been when they weren't morphed. They were definitely friendly towards each other, for the most part, but outside of Danny and Max, and then Shayla and Merrick kind of, there's not a ton done with team dynamics, which is another thing holding back Wild Force as a season. And I'd be hard pressed to say that Cole has a legitimate season-defining relationship with anyone on his team. only really a handful of Taylor moments because she has to awkwardly pass on the torch of leadership for some reason. Which finally brings us to the Queen Eagle herself, Taylor Earhart. I'm not sure if Wild Force was intentionally trying to bring in another Jen-like tough as nails unbreakable badass, but I'm sure glad they did. But she's no Jen clone, mind you, because by rooting her persona in her Air Force background, Wild Force created a unique and very essential Ranger. And of all the Rangers here, she's the one that grows the most, going through a very patient and downplayed season-spanning character arc. It's pretty fitting that she'd eventually develop a love-hate relationship with Eric, because the dynamic she has with Cole is very similar to the one Wes had with him. In both cases, one Ranger eventually sees something in the other that the rigid mentalities didn't allow them to see before. Cole's unique liveliness eventually transformed Taylor into someone who could actually smile again, but even still, I take issue with Cole's quick transition. Taylor had been leading the team for a year. That's a very long time. And the show makes it clear that the only reason she's not leading anymore is because Cole just so happens to be the Red Ranger. It's crazy, right? Because right after Time Force proved the contrary, this season still pretends that the colors should mean anything. Need I remind anyone of Red Ranger Rocky? It simply makes no sense here. So whatever resentment Taylor might have felt is totally justified, because Shayla is not good at her job. But Wild Force also misses the chance to create a novel dynamic by having these two push each other without the need for romance afterwards. They do it once, but this isn't the kind of thing that can or should be fixed in 22 minutes, or even 44. What this all goes back to is a season with good and great characters, but mostly on an isolated individual level. Because of that, Eric ends up being the character Taylor connects to more than anyone on her actual team. It did help make Reinforcements that much better as a team-up episode though. And don't worry, we'll get there very soon. But Taylor had probably the best Zord episode, because that episode actually challenged her. It forced her to become passionate, something she's not good at, and her new powers were awarded in kind. Meanwhile, Danny's extra Zords come to him because the Bison literally phoned up some friends. I'm not even kidding. I'll make one final point about Taylor. The one thing above all else that made her one of the greatest Yellow Rangers ever, and among my favorite Rangers in any color. Wild Force placed a lot of emphasis on Taylor's past, both as a long-tenured Ranger and as an Air Force pilot. More than any character this season, we can see where she's coming from and how she changes. On top of that, the reason she joined the Air Force and became a Ranger is tied. It involved being blown away by seeing the animarium outside her plane window. Even for as strict and as rule-bound and as rigid as she is, the show makes sure to emphasize the kid inside that drove her to this point, which is why kids were at the center of her two early moments of growth. A year of Ranger battles stripped her of that childlike fascination, but over the course of the season, she got it back. She remembered why she was here. She never had to say it much, because she's a very internal person, but you see it. And as it begins for Taylor, so it finishes, with her still as captivated as ever by the majesty of the sky, as she was all that time ago, when her purpose wasn't aerial combat, but to simply find the legendary floating turtle. She's a professional in every sense of the word, the mature, seasoned backbone of a relatively immature team. So, having her recall a time when she wasn't any of that, before the pressure of both her jobs kicked in, that's as spot on as it gets. But at this point, I've talked your ears off about Taylor, so before we talk more about the villains, let's discuss Princess Shayla. To be fair, she is part of the story, but to be frank, she doesn't add anything to the story. Not even her relationship with Merrick does much for either character, and when you're in the mentor or advisor role, adding nothing is a clear flaw. They could have told a million different stories with her, maybe even addressed the question of why she's still a princess when there doesn't seem to be a royal family around. Maybe her parents were killed off by the original Master Org, and if they were, well look at that, suddenly she has something to add to Cole's arc. But on top of her being underutilized and underwhelming when she does do things, she's the one that told the Rangers that the finale was too much for them. She can use all the pretty excuses she wants, but at the end of the day, she gave up on the Rangers. She spent over a year assembling specifically for this. That detail alone makes her worse than Mentor G ever was. Now let's discuss the villains here, starting with the Duke Org pair of Jindrax and Toxica. With them is really where you see a lot of early days Rangers coming back. There's a lot of Rita and Toxica, and a fair bit of Goldar and Jindrax. Just a pair of wacky, out-of-their-depths villains that sometimes feel like they're in a different show, if only because of the darker tone Master Org is setting. I already touched on my issues of Org hierarchy and how this show doesn't do anything with it, but it's still weird to me that neither Cole nor the show really truly acknowledge the fact that these Orgs do have hearts until much, much later. And they are free to have change of hearts too, as we see in the excellent two-parter The Master's Herald. In these episodes, Toxica and Jindrax are absolute stars, but especially Jindrax. Toxica goes through the hell of being tricked into losing her own horn, which ends up being one of the most hard-hitting moments of the season, and Jindrax says to hell with Orgs, finally fed up with all the backstabbing and deception. We've seen the idea of big evil bosses treating their underlings like dirt before. This is one of the best examples thereof, because the formerly evil pair finally reach a breaking point and are given the chance to do something about it. Master Org is a really good villain, mainly because he's got a really good backstory. He's not just here because he's evil, he's here because he chose to surrender his humanity, making him a better version of what Samurai couldn't really establish well with Decker and Dayu. This season values life and protecting the Earth, but Master Org values none of that. In fact, Master Org wants Cole to fight him, maybe even wants Cole to kill him, and he takes great pride in having been the guy to off the girl he used to want to marry. When it comes down to it, I'm not sure there's a more mentally twisted villain in all of Rangers, to the point where the only way he could have ever found peace is through death. I wouldn't say that there's as good of a hero-villain connection here as there was with Jungle Fury or in Space, but that pivotal separation between him and Cole, how one values life and the other does not, that's very well done. So, now let's finally talk about the team-up episodes and why I loved Reinforcements and really liked Forever Red. And we'll start with Forever Red because it's a bit more straightforward. So, Carter recruits Cole to join the Red Ranger super team. Now let's take a moment to appreciate the fact that the overly maligned Disney era got every Red Ranger at the time to return, even Oriko. These days, we get 2 whole seasons of dinosaurs and not a single cameo from the most utilized motif in Rangers. Plot-wise, it's all about teaming up and stopping Venjix, not that one, and what's left of the Machine Empire, and they do it in the Blue Beauty herself, all capped off by the return of the most devastating Evil Zord ever built in Serpentera. Almost everything about this episode is awesome, plot holes be damned, but using only the Rookie Ranger to take out the Serpentera, a little unbelievable, to say the very least. Yes, we get it, sell new toys, budget concerns, etc, etc. But you really had all of history's Red Rangers not even contribute in the end? A great setup with a lackluster ending. This was the kind of episode that really needed to be 2 parts or more to get the most out of the concept. A lot goes flying by us at Mach speed to cap everything at 22 minutes. As a result, not a lot is done with the potential for novel character dynamics. For example, imagine Carter talking to Oriko about firefighting. Oriko, being from a water planet, wouldn't have a clue as to why anyone would need firefighters. That's not the best idea, but hey, it's something. And we also kind of waste some very well designed robots. Yeah. But seeing every single Red Ranger at the time morph at once, chills. And TJ ending things by joking about the infamous pizza episode, hilarious. Now, let's pivot to Reinforcements from the future. With it, we get the return of the Time Force Rangers, including a still stodgy as ever Eric Myers. It serves as a unique checkpoint for Taylor's development, who is used to rules and order, but in this opening scene, she's far more elusive for driving. But the core of this 2-parter, and why it's one of the best, is all about progress and continuation, a trait most team-ups don't get. Here's where Reinforcements gets it right. It's a Wild Force episode that knows and perfectly progresses the Time Force ideas still in progress. It makes great use of what the previous season established to give us unforgettable moments. That is, if you've seen Time Force. We know why Trip is so excited to see Wes again. We know why Eric and Taylor wouldn't get along at first. We know why Wes seeing Jen again is so powerful. You know, beyond the, you know, she looks very nice anyways, and to top it all off, we get a reformed Rancic helping out the team this time. But why is he doing it? because he made a mistake that he now feels he needs to fix, just like Merrick did, just like Master Org couldn't do. He already changed his destiny, so what was brilliant here is that Rancic is now being used to connect to a significant feature of Wild Force, something that creates a clear separation between who he is now and the villain at large currently. Rancic changed to save someone he loved. Master Org killed someone he allegedly loved and regrets nothing. We could do this all day. It's beautiful. And narratively, it's something very few team-up episodes even attempt. Both seasons effectively share the spotlight here, and I think both teams come out the better for it. Now let's discuss the season finale, and boy is it a memorable one for several reasons. In the lead-up episode, Sealing the Nexus, the recently converted Toxica and Jindrax help the Rangers free Princess Shayla. By destroying the Nexus, the Rangers supposedly destroyed Master Org as well, and so ends the war between Orgs and humans. At least for now, since remember, they didn't really do anything about the pollution that caused all this. But anyways, the Master returns for one final showdown. This two-parter is fittingly called The End of the Power Rangers, because as some of you know, it was almost cancelled again. I'd like to say that this season found a way to be captivating enough to save the franchise as In Space once did, but really, it was cost-effective New Zealand. But knowing the background on it now, it makes the opening moments of Part 1 all the more emotional. The Rangers are celebrating their apparent victory, but now, it's all over. And the team is at a loss for what to do. Not even Taylor is sure about her future, since finding the Animarium was her main inspiration for joining the Air Force. But all of that has to be put on hold, since Master Org has returned as powerful as ever. Even Animus comes back out of hiding for this battle of battles, a parallel to his battle 3,000 years ago. But because Shayla is just so great at this mentorship thing, she decides that helping Animus guard the Earth would be too much to ask of the Guardians of the Earth. Animus falls in combat once again, as Merrick was unable to rewrite that bit of history. And now, Master Org brings the fight to them, and starts picking off Wild Zords left and right. It is a devastating fight, and the shattering crystals only add to the feeling of helplessness against the unstoppable monster that was once Dr. Adler. This entire final conflict was another reason why making the Wild Zords feel more alive was such a great idea. This Ranger team went through quite a bit to assemble one of the largest Zord arsenals in history, and now all of that work was being forcibly stripped away. This would have worked a lot better, however, if more than just Taylor and Cole felt challenged through the process of acquiring said Zords. But even still, having all the Zords mercilessly stolen and their powers along with it, excellent setup, leading into Part 2. And in Part 2, the world is coming to an end. But even now, the Power Rangers won't stop fighting. Even with their most daunting test breathing down their throats, even with the entire franchise at risk of cancellation, the Power Rangers would not stop fighting. And in comes the defining moment of the season. No Zords, no Morphers, pouring rain and dark as the pits of hell, and still, the Rangers soldier on. This wasn't just a powerful moment for this season. This was one of the most powerful moments in the entire franchise. And Cole Evans was the perfect Ranger to lead this specific moment. And interestingly enough, that resolve ended up saving the day. I call it interesting because when you think about it, the whole thing was basically a much better version of Kite's original test. With nothing but the tattered clothes on your back, would you still keep fighting to save the world? The answer was an emphatic yes. Given the circumstances that surrounded this season, the writers must have known that this could have been it. That with Saban no longer running things, this episode could have been true to its name and ended the Power Rangers. It's a brilliant incorporation of a real-life story into a fictional one. I've talked about it in several videos now. This franchise has a majestic way of turning real-world setbacks into on-screen highlight reels. They did it in Lost Galaxy. They would go on to do it again in Jungle Fury. And they did it here. Wild Force is a season where something always feels missing that could have made it exceptional or at least more complete. The characters were all pretty good, but relative to better seasons, there was a lot of development left on the table, and not a ton of focus on internal dynamics. The episodes that didn't have Kite in them were mostly solid or better, but when you have a character like Max, who really could have used a more defined arc, solid wasn't quite enough. But what really makes Wild Force almost great is the bigger picture. The internal complexity of the orgs as species doesn't factor into the story, the pollution angle barely factors into the story, and the value of life angle they do focus on only really applies to Cole, Master Org, and sometimes to Merrick and the Duke orgs. Comparatively, only Lucas is left out of Time Force's bigger, grander picture, and Jungle Fury gives everyone something to learn, even the Masters. In closing, I'd place Wild Force a little bit higher than Mystic Force, which, as some of you recall, also could have been great. There's a lot to like and love about this season, but also several key problem areas, and what it all adds up to is a pretty good season of Rangers. I just wouldn't call it great, which is also why I really need to update my top 10 best Ranger seasons video one of these days. Time Force somehow ended up lower than Wild Force on that list, if you can believe that, so yeah, it has not aged well at all, but all in good time. And until then, thanks for watching.